It started in a quiet courthouse on a rainy Tuesday, one of those days where everyone's patience was thin and tempers lay just beneath the surface. A young nurse, Megan Holloway, stood in front of the judge's bench, still dressed in her pale blue scrubs, her face flushed with quiet embarrassment. She wasn't a defendant. She wasn't even scheduled to speak. She was simply there to support a patient, a war veteran, who had no one else to advocate for him. But to Judge Carmichael, her appearance was unacceptable. The courtroom had barely settled when the judge's gavel struck. "Miss Holloway," he said sharply, "this is a court of law, not a hospital ward. Do you think your attire is respectful of this chamber?" Megan swallowed her protest. She had come straight from a 12-hour shift, after driving 40 minutes across town just to keep a promise. But instead of gratitude, she faced humiliation. And then a voice broke the silence. Low, firm, British. "She's wearing more honor than anyone in this room." Heads turned. From the back of the courtroom, a man rose, tall, composed, and commanding. Jason Statham. He hadn't come to be seen. He hadn't planned to speak. But when integrity is challenged, when decency is mocked in the name of procedure, some men can't stay seated. The courtroom shifted. Suddenly, it wasn't about rules. It was about right and wrong. What happened next stunned everyone. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Because this story, this moment, will stay with you long after the gavel drops. Megan Holloway wasn't someone who made waves. She lived in the quiet part of town, worked the overnight ER shift at St. Luke's Community Hospital, and cared for patients others had forgotten. Her life revolved around dignity, the kind most folks didn't notice until it was gone. Her favorite patients weren't always the sickest, but the loneliest. People like Hank Rollins, a 74-year-old Vietnam veteran who had seen too much, lost too much, and now sat at the mercy of a legal system that barely remembered his name. Hank had been caught up in a landlord dispute, one of those cold, bureaucratic nightmares where a technicality could cost a man his home. Megan had been the one to help him fill out his paperwork, drive him to the courthouse, and sit beside him while he waited for his case to be heard. She didn't plan on walking into that courtroom in her scrubs, but after back-to-back trauma cases and a nurse short-staffing crisis, she had no time to change. It was either show up like that, or not at all. The judge didn't see a nurse. He saw disrespect. That's how Megan ended up being scolded like a child in front of a full courtroom. What most people didn't know was that another man sat in that courtroom, a few rows back. Jason Statham wasn't there on any official business. He had arrived, quietly, at the request of an old friend. He hadn't seen Hank Rollins in decades, not since a military op overseas that left more scars than medals. But when Hank reached out through a VA social worker, Jason didn't hesitate. He showed up, quietly, without a name tag or entourage. Just a man keeping his promise. He didn't expect to speak. Until dignity was on the line. Judge Robert Carmichael was known for his discipline. A stickler for order, timing, and appearance, he believed that decorum was the last thread holding society together. To him, a courtroom wasn't just a place of law, it was a sacred theater of accountability, and anything less than full decorum was a threat to its sanctity. That morning, he had already been frustrated. A backlog of civil disputes, delayed documentation, a misfiled eviction claim that put the docket 2 hours behind. When Megan stepped up in her hospital scrubs, the judge saw not a tired professional, but another sign of a system unraveling. His rebuke was immediate and public, but what he didn't account for was the room, the quiet murmurs, the small shifts in posture from people who recognized compassion when they saw it. People who, for a moment, saw Megan not as a disruption, but as the only person in that building who had shown up for someone else. Jason watched all of it. His eyes didn't leave Megan's face. He recognized the look, faintly embarrassed, quietly proud. He'd seen it on battlefield medics who stitched wounds under enemy fire, on local villagers who risked their lives to help injured soldiers. That quiet grace under fire. He looked to Hank. The man sat trembling, trying not to meet anyone's gaze, feeling the sting of shame that wasn't his to carry. Jason didn't rise to make a scene. He stood because the air had gone still, like it did right before something breaks. His voice was calm. "She's wearing more honor than anyone in this room." The judge froze, and so did everyone else. The silence wasn't about fear. It was about the rare presence of truth, spoken plainly by a man who didn't care for applause. The judge's expression shifted from superiority to uncertainty. He didn't know who Jason was. Not exactly. But the man's posture, his unflinching tone, carried the weight of someone used to commanding silence, someone who had seen more than courtroom drama. "I'm not interested in theatrics," the judge replied, his tone clipped. "This court has rules." Jason stepped forward, calm and measured. "And this woman came straight from saving lives to help a man who's been forgotten. That should count for something. Are you her attorney?" "No. Just someone who believes in showing respect when it's earned." A hushed gasp rippled across the courtroom. Jason's accent stood out, but it wasn't foreign, it was grounding. The type of voice that didn't have to yell to make its presence known. The judge, already battling a long day and his own pride, narrowed his eyes. "This is a court of law, not a forum for personal morality." Jason's eyes didn't waver. "Then maybe your court is overdue for both." The room stilled. Megan didn't speak. She stood frozen, torn between gratitude and fear that Jason's words would make things worse. But in truth, something was shifting. The bailiff, normally stone-faced, leaned slightly forward. The court clerk paused mid-typing. Even Hank, worn and shrunken by life, looked up, hope flickering in eyes long dulled by disappointment. The judge, sensing his control slipping, banged the gavel again. "That's enough. One more outburst and I'll have you removed." Jason nodded once. "Then remove me." But he didn't leave. He waited, not out of defiance, out of discipline, because sometimes justice doesn't need shouting. It just needs one man willing to stand until the room remembers what it means to be decent. The judge leaned back, unsettled. For the first time in years, he wasn't in complete control. Not because someone had defied his rules, but because someone had quietly questioned their purpose. Jason's presence wasn't aggressive. It was principled, unapologetic, and that unnerved a man used to compliance. Megan stood quietly beside Hank, her heart pounding. She had always believed in service above self. It's what her father, a firefighter, had taught her. But moments like this, when the weight of doing right turned public and uncomfortable, those were harder. And yet something about Jason's stance gave her strength. She took a breath and stepped forward. "Your Honor, I meant no disrespect, but Mr. Rollins has no one. He asked me to be here. I stayed late on my shift so I wouldn't let him down. I'm not here to argue with you, I'm just here for him." That struck something in the room. A simple truth. Honest, undeniable. Judge Carmichael glanced at Hank, who now looked straight ahead. The man's record was clean, his case simple, a dispute over back rent during a period where his VA checks were delayed due to an administrative error, not malicious, just bureaucratic. But without advocacy, he would have lost everything. Jason didn't speak again. He didn't need to. His point had landed. The room sat in a kind of quiet awareness, not of tension, but of perspective, the kind that reminds people why the law exists at all. The judge tapped his fingers against the bench, slowly, thoughtfully, and for the first time that day, his voice softened. "Miss Holloway, thank you. This court recognizes your service and your support for Mr. Rollins. I see no issue with your presence here. Let's proceed with the hearing." It wasn't a victory. It was a reminder. The shift in tone was subtle, but it swept through the room like fresh air through a long sealed window. Megan exhaled softly, feeling the first hint of validation, not for herself, but for Hank. The old man gripped the sides of his chair, eyes blinking faster now, as though years of being overlooked had suddenly given way to being seen. Jason returned to his seat without a word. He hadn't come for a fight. His presence had done what it needed to do. He offered Megan a brief nod, acknowledging not just her courage, but her restraint. Sometimes, standing still takes more strength than raising a fist. Judge Carmichael turned his attention to the matter at hand. "Mr. Rollins," he said, "I've reviewed your case file. The documentation of delayed VA payments is verified. Your landlord's filing, while technically permissible, appears opportunistic. This court doesn't serve opportunists." The landlord's attorney, a young man with slick hair and an overused briefcase, stood to object. "Your Honor, we followed every required legal—" "Sit down," the judge interrupted. "You followed a broken clock. I intend to reset it." Megan placed a hand gently on Hank's shoulder, and the man smiled, a small, weathered smile, but real. In less than 10 minutes, the eviction was dismissed. Hank would keep his home. His benefits would be reviewed for future protection. And for once, he left a room with more than just paperwork. He left with dignity. But the moment, while powerful, wasn't without complexity. Because as the court recessed and people began to file out, the judge paused. He looked toward Jason and asked, "Would you stay behind for a moment?" Jason's gaze held steady, because while the matter of Hank was closed, something deeper had just begun. The courtroom emptied, but the silence between the remaining 3 men felt heavier than before. Judge Carmichael stepped down from the bench, slowly loosening his collar as if peeling off the weight of the robe itself. He didn't speak at first, just studied Jason with a gaze honed by years of extracting truth without force. "You served?" the judge asked finally, his voice low. Jason nodded once. "A long time ago." The judge hesitated, then sat on the edge of the front pew. "I thought so. The way you stood. You don't learn that in law school." Jason offered no reaction. The silence drew out the next thought from the judge. "You humiliated me," Carmichael said. "Wasn't my intention," Jason replied. "Only wanted to remind the room why people matter." "That's the problem, isn't it?" the judge said, almost to himself. "We get so wrapped in the ritual. We forget the reason." Jason folded his arms. Not confrontational, just steady. "Why ask me to stay?" The judge looked away for a moment, then back. "Because I've been sitting behind that bench for 27 years, and today's the first time someone made me feel like I was on trial." A beat passed. Heavy. With tension, but not hostility. "You weren't wrong," Carmichael continued. "But neither was I. The law needs form, it needs respect." Jason tilted his head slightly. "And sometimes it needs to remember the people it's written for." The judge nodded slowly. "You made your point. But I need to ask, what's your stake in all this? Hank Rollins? You don't seem like a guy who just happens to be in court on a Tuesday morning." Jason's eyes darkened, not with anger, but with memory. "Hank saved my life once," he said. "This was me returning the favor." The judge sat in silence, for a long moment, absorbing the weight of Jason's words. There was something in the way he spoke that made it clear. This wasn't about gratitude. It was about duty. About paying off a moral debt that couldn't be measured in dollars or decades. "Tell me what happened," Carmichael said softly. "If you're willing." Jason glanced at the door, as if weighing whether to stay or walk out. But something about the stillness of the room made him sit down instead, opposite the judge on the same level as men rather than titles. "We were in Kandahar," Jason began. 2003, a failed extraction. Things went sideways. I took shrapnel to the leg, lost a lot of blood. Hank pulled me out, carried me through 2 kilometers of desert with sniper fire ringing in his ears. Didn't know me, didn't ask, just acted. Carmichael swallowed, eyes tight. "And after?" "I recovered," Jason said. "Went back, finished the mission. Hank retired quietly, no fanfare. Lived on the edge of town ever since." The judge leaned forward. "And he never asked you for anything?" "Not once," Jason said. "Until last week, when he got the eviction notice, called me, embarrassed, like he was ashamed to be needing help." The judge looked away, visibly moved. That's the thing about men like him. They give everything and ask for nothing. And when they finally do, we treat them like burdens. Jason stood slowly. I'm not here to judge you, but I needed you to see him. Really see him. Carmichael nodded. I did. And in that quiet, solemn courtroom, something shifted. Not just in their conversation, but in the judge himself, a man who had spent decades upholding the law, and just remembered why it was worth doing. Later that evening, Megan sat beside Hank in a small diner just off Main Street. The court papers were folded neatly on the table between them, next to 2 untouched cups of coffee. The legal jargon meant little to Hank, but the word dismissed was all he needed to understand. Still can't believe it, he murmured, staring at the papers. Didn't think anyone would show up. You mattered, Megan said, her voice gentle. You always did. Outside the window, Jason leaned against a light pole, watching through the glass. He wasn't one for goodbyes or drawn-out thanks, but he needed to see Hank in this moment, whole, safe, and untouched by the bitterness the world had tried to press on him. Megan stepped outside a minute later. He still doesn't know what to say, she told Jason. He doesn't need to, Jason replied. He showed up for me when it counted. This was just the return trip. She studied him, trying to place exactly what kind of man he was. Not a hero, not a savior, just someone who believed in showing up when others walked away. Are you heading out now? She asked. Jason nodded. Another promise to keep, always is. She reached out and shook his hand, firm and sincere. Thank you. You didn't just help him. You reminded the rest of us what standing up looks like. Jason paused. Standing up's easy. Staying standing, that's the hard part. Then he turned, disappearing into the dusk like he'd come. Quiet, watchful, necessary. Back inside the diner, Hank took a long sip of coffee and stared at the door. He's a good man, he said softly. Megan nodded. One of the last of his kind. And in that stillness, peace settled, hard-earned, fully felt. There are moments in life that pass quietly, unnoticed by the world at large, but for those who live them, they become legend. What happened in that courtroom wasn't about drama or confrontation. It was about decency, about one man standing when others stayed seated, about another man being seen after a lifetime of invisibility, and a young woman, tired and worn, holding her ground with quiet strength. Judge Carmichael returned to his bench the next day with the same robe, the same gavel, but something had shifted. He was more deliberate, more human, and while he didn't say so aloud, those who came before him felt the difference. Fewer dismissals, more patience, less posturing. Megan returned to St. Luke's that same evening, blending back into the flurry of hospital life. But her co-workers noticed it too, a fire in her eyes, not born of rebellion but conviction, the understanding that even when you're exhausted, standing beside someone might just save them. And Hank? He planted tomatoes the next morning in the small backyard of the house he nearly lost. With aching knees and an unsteady back, he watered the roots gently, whispering to them like old friends. Because dignity isn't loud, it grows quietly when no one's watching. As for Jason, he was gone, no spotlight, no name in the paper. But his ripple remained, in every nurse who speaks up, every judge who listens, every veteran who finds a hand instead of a wall, because some men don't need medals to be remembered. They just need to do the right thing. If this story moved you, if you've ever been the one to stand alone or needed someone who did, let us know in the comments. Where you're watching from, we read every word and we stand with you.